At some point, everybody's thought about the horrific possibility of being buried alive, but that's just Hollywood nonsense, right? Well, surprisingly, it's more of a real possibility than many of us would like to believe, and it's more common than you'd expect. It turns out diagnosing death isn't as black and white as it seems, and for one Brazilian woman in 2018, this fact became a terrifying reality. This is her story. Rosângela Almeida dos Santos was just 37 years old when she was declared dead by doctors at her local hospital near Riacho das Neves, Brazil. According to her death certificate, Santos died from septic shock on 28 January 2019. She'd also suffered 2 heart attacks, all spanning from a respiratory infection. Santos's family buried her the next day in Senhora Santana Cemetery, a little way from their home and close to other residential properties. The scarcely middle-aged woman was buried in a wooden coffin inside a concrete, above-ground tomb, as per the customs of her hometown. Relatives, especially Santos's mother, were understandably distraught when Natalina Silva, a local woman who lived close to the cemetery, told them she'd heard moans coming from the graveyard. In fact, the moans had been coming from Santos's grave. Silva later told a local news site that when she first heard banging, she assumed it was kids playing an insensitive prank. But when she went to investigate, she realized there were faint groans coming from within the tomb. Santos's family were alerted, and there was a dramatic rush to the burial site, where relatives immediately began to dismantle everything between themselves and Rosângela. They did something they never dreamed they'd need to. They cracked open the tomb of their beloved family member after only 11 days buried. When they finally got to the coffin, they pulled it from its resting place. Shockingly, the nails keeping its lid down were loose, as if someone had been attempting to bash it open from the inside. Once they removed the lid, things only got worse. Santos clearly didn't look as though she'd been dead and buried for 11 days. She looked more like she was sleeping, but her forehead and hands were injured, as if she'd been trying to fight her way out of the coffin. Whatever the case was, over the next few days it became clear that Santos was now truly dead. Sadly, she wasn't coming back. But the worst part of it all was that on the day they dug her up, when a family member touched her, they remarked that Santos's body was still warm. Had her family been just moments too late? As wild as it sounds, it's entirely possible. Miss Almeida dos Santos may indeed have been buried alive. Not only does Santos's family have to come to terms with that shocking reality, they could also be prosecuted for defiling her grave. But if Santos had been wrongly buried, shouldn't her doctors be held responsible? Well, blaming the professionals might not be as fair as it seems. Bodies have sprung back to life in morgues all over the world, even following hours of cold storage after death certificates were signed by experts. The fact is, doctors can't always be 100% sure a person is dead. In some cases, medicines like atropine can slow the heart rate to the point that a pulse is nearly impossible to detect. As recently as 2014, a Kenyan man who'd been declared dead reanimated in the hospital mortuary the next day, terrifying the attendant. He'd consumed a large amount of insecticide, and the drug used to treat him had slowed his heartbeat to an undetectable pulse. In other cases of misdiagnosed death, poorly trained staff are responsible. An Irish hospital launched an investigation into the competence of its staff in 2007 after a man was wrongly pronounced dead, only to awake mere hours later. Equally, in parts of the US, coroners don't need a medical degree, and yet they have the power to pronounce people dead. Any of these issues could have been responsible for Santos's misfortune. Then there's the question of what dead means. Sure, it seems obvious, but the more we learn about how the body works, the vaguer the term becomes. Before science got to where it is today, it was simpler. If, for an extended period, a person wasn't breathing or their heart didn't seem to be beating, they were usually declared dead. But, as we know now, several different processes need to have stopped in the body for someone to be completely dead, and for decomposition to begin. We now regard someone as legally dead when they show no brain function. But the machines responsible for monitoring this, like all technology, are capable of errors on rare occasions. Plus, even brain-dead patients can be kept somewhat alive by life support equipment. Their hearts are kept beating electronically, while their lungs are mechanically kept breathing. But death can be put on hold too. If a body's cold enough, everything slows down, sending cells into a kind of hibernation. This can happen when a not quite dead person is slipped into the fridge of a morgue for a few hours, for example, and could continue until burial if the turnaround is quick. Santos wasn't left hanging around for long after she was declared dead. Indeed, she was buried the following day. If something was causing her to appear dead, like medication or a deep coma, she could have remained in a difficult-to-detect state of living during that time. But what would have happened to Santos in her tomb? How could she last 11 days, and what would those days be like? Well, dark and claustrophobic for sure. But there's also oxygen to worry about. Scientists can't seem to agree on how long someone might survive in a sealed coffin. Most estimates range from 10 minutes to 36 hours. We do know, though, that the smaller you are, the longer you'll have. A smaller person uses less oxygen, and there's a limited amount of oxygen in a standard coffin. As a petite woman, Santos may have had longer than average, but could that have stretched to 11 days? On average, a person uses up about half a liter of oxygen every minute, but Santos was most likely kept cold for quite some time in the morgue. Her respiration was likely slowed by the drugs she was given at the hospital, which may have included painkillers and possibly even sedatives. This was, of course, in tandem with the effects of her heart attacks, sepsis, and later the cold of the morgue. If these factors left her cells in a state of reduced respiration, this would considerably increase the time she could spend in a sealed coffin. On top of this, if there was even a small crack in the wood or outer tomb structure, or the lid wasn't totally flush with the coffin sides, some air may have been circulating. With the slower breath of sleep or coma, even a small amount of fresh air may have been enough to keep Santos alive. If Santos was unconscious for most of her time in the dark tomb, but then woke up and began struggling, she would have suddenly started using oxygen at a much higher rate. A panicked state of exertion could have easily caused her death if oxygen was scarce. The damage to her forehead and hands indicated that she'd been straining her already weakened body as she clawed at the roof of her prison and moaned for help. On top of the aftermath of multiple heart attacks and deadly sepsis, Santos would be weakened by hunger and extreme dehydration. 11 days would see her well on her way to serious starvation, but her lack of movement, if she was unconscious, would have helped her survive longer. Her body's use of water would be similarly reduced. But 11 days is a seriously long time to go without a drink, and could conceivably have caused her death. But then again, the record for surviving without water is 18 days. The record belongs to an unlucky Austrian by the name of Andreas Mihavec, who was accidentally left alone in a police holding cell for over 2 weeks. Mihavec reportedly licked condensation from the walls, which Santos may also have been able to do, so 11 days may have been possible. But in all likelihood, it was a combination of starvation, dehydration, and residual sickness that finally killed Santos. As far as ideal places to recover from life-threatening illnesses go, a sealed coffin has to be near the bottom of the list. Imagine having a heart attack and then waking up in a coffin. That's enough to give you a second heart attack. There's no doubt that if Santos was conscious in her tomb, her last moments would have been hellish. She may well have been one of the many people who suffer from taphophobia, or the fear of being buried alive. I'm sure her family all do now. Unfortunately, taphophobia is not such an irrational fear, and Santos is only the most recent example of premature burial or misdiagnosed death. There are recorded cases going back as far as the 1300s, when a Scottish priest called Duns Scotus reportedly managed to break free from his grave after being mistakenly pronounced dead and buried. A more verifiable case was recorded in 1891, when Octavia Smith Hatcher of Pikeville, Kentucky, was buried alive after a long depression following the death of her infant son. Around at the same time, people of the town began to suffer from a sleeping sickness caused by the bite of the tsetse fly, which caused people to appear dead for a time before reanimating. Octavia's husband James grew concerned that a similar sickness had overcome his wife, and that she'd been prematurely buried. James hurriedly exhumed her grave, overcome with worry. When her coffin was opened, it was clear that Octavia had shredded its interior, splitting her nails and flipping onto her front. James despaired, seeing that his wife had quite literally turned in her grave at her terrible fate. A little more recently, there was the case of Angelo Hayes in 1937. Hayes was involved in a horrific motorcycle accident, sustaining a head injury that would make Jigsaw queasy. Hayes was hastily interred in the village cemetery at Saint-Quentin-de-Chalais, France. Luckily for Hayes, he was exhumed mere days later because of an investigation relating to an insurance claim. To their disbelief, the insurance inspectors found Hayes in a coma, but very much alive. His injury had caused his system to shut down, but only for a while, causing him to briefly appear dead. In a comeback story for the ages, Hayes not only recovered, but also went on to become a minor celebrity. He appeared regularly on TV to promote the safety coffin he invented to help others avoid his terrifying fate, coming complete with a food locker, chemical toilet, book collection, and radio transmitter. I'm even thinking of swapping my bed for one of these bad boys. While the practice of fitting out coffins with breathing tubes and bells to alert the surface world of a false burial enjoyed some popularity in the 18th and 19th centuries, the trend was short-lived. But after hearing these stories, do you think the trend deserves a comeback? As is evidenced by Santos' story, it's a legitimate concern even to this day. Hopefully, the mystery of what caused her premature burial will one day be uncovered, and her family will have some closure. And hopefully they won't be arrested for desecrating her grave. They were justified after all. But whatever happens, let's all at least take a few lessons from this. Firstly, dead isn't always dead. And secondly, if you do find yourself trapped in a coffin, breathe slowly and try to find some condensation to lick. In fact, why not go and tell your family right now that you want to be buried with your mobile phone and a really loud whistle? Better that than being buried alive. Or worse, waking up during your own cremation. What would you do if you were buried alive? What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen? Maybe you now have taphophobia? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.